In good capitalist fashion, of course, zoos are for-profit corporations that quite literally make a killing out of charging people to see these endangered animals.
This is a story that I can't give a whole lot of specifics on for a lot of reasons. But my brother is, he's involved with financials. He's working on his CPA right now. And he has friends that do a lot of auditing work. And one of the stories that he actually talked to me about recently that kind of confirmed something that I always knew to kind of be true, but actually gave me something that I could talk about concretely. He had a friend who actually worked on auditing for a very famous zoo out in California. And, well, he didn't, of course, talk about the specifics of the case. One of the things that he did reiterate in his feelings about it was, dude, you'd be surprised how unimpressive, the actual, what they come away with in the end is. A big place like that. They care for a lot of endangered species down there. I remember visiting the San Diego Zoo specifically, and I remember one part of the zoo was literally enclosure after enclosure after enclosure of super endangered, super exotic animal. But at the end of the day, these zoos, and I've never encountered an AZA zoo that wasn't a nonprofit. I don't know if there's some rules about that. If there are, I don't know. I'm sure there could be something. The only zoos that I've come across that seem to be for-profit are ones that are not AZA, that are not kept to those standards. Really, zoos I would want to have nothing to do with. But those nonprofit zoos, the real zoos, the AZA zoos in North America, that money goes to their animals. That goes to taking care of everything, to doing the best they can. Grants with zoos are very important. That's a big reason why it's very prestigious to be an AZA, because you have access to more monetary grants. And what the state allows your zoo is very important. How many animals you can have, how big your zoo can get, and how you're able to take care of the animals. There are a few cases, one in my area that you can read about. There's been several articles published about it where the state government has, threatened to cut budget as far as, how much money they were willing to give to the zoo. And, one of the things that zoos can say is, in a very real way, there's some animals that if a zoo closes, some of them you may not be able to place. They may not have anywhere to put some of those animals. There's been times where zoos have threatened, the reality that some of those animals might have to be euthanized. It's not pretty, it's not nice, but that's a leverage point that some zoos have made in times of real strife, or what the state was willing to give them was being threatened, when their livelihood was very threatened. So, folks, I don't know what to say. It is what it is. Money is finite in this world. Zoos are not getting the lion's share. Sometimes you gotta hustle. I remember one story from another zoo that I worked at that kind of highlights the real lack of funds that everyone has to work with at the end of the day, and the real importance of getting sums of money and the desperation in some ways. But there was a millionaire in the area that lived in the area where this zoo was, that or he was some kind of very wealthy individual, and he called the curator of that zoo, and he said, "Listen, my wife is obsessed with giant anteaters. She can't stop talking about them. She can't get enough of them. If you were somehow able to get a giant anteater in one of your exhibits at your zoo, I would be willing to donate $250K. Straight up." And it was not a coincidence that, you find out that at that zoo, the curator just happened to be able to place a surplus anteater in one of the rainforest buildings at that zoo. It happened very quickly. I remember that exhibit went up really quickly. An exhibit that had been largely empty for a long period of time. And so that happened. It was very real. Moved it right in there.
And the animals that get the most care are defined by how much traffic they generate, not at all how endangered they are, how much care they need.
I worked in one zoo that was in a city, And one thing that I remember about that zoo is that they had a group of giraffes. And one of those males in that group of giraffes was unique, maybe even on some level famous within the zookeeping field, because he had survived chronic wasting disorder, CWD, which is very similar to mad cow. It's very similar to scrapies that sheep get. It's a neurological thing. Cells degenerate. They go into an inoperable form. And it's associated with malnutrition, chronic malnutrition, protein deficiencies, fat loss, muscle atrophy. It's very sad. And up until this animal, a giraffe had never survived with CWD. And giraffes themselves are very, very unique animals. If you think about what a giraffe is, what it looks like, how it's put together, you have the body, the main body on a very low level, and the head way suspended up high above it, with a significantly long neck in between the whole thing. The heart of a giraffe works very hard for circulation, to pump blood up that neck, fighting against the very real amount of gravity that has up against it. Giraffes, from what I understand, they don't sleep very long. They don't really kneel down much. Transporting them is something that I've watched videos on, and it always seems to be that the conclusion is that if you can't drive them somewhere, it can't really be done. I remember at some of the other places that I worked at where when I was there, they actually knocked down the animals. They put them under anesthesia for medical examinations. And that was a very tricky, a very persnickety thing, because of the realities that I've talked about, because of how their circulation is, and how their physiology is, and how unique it is. When you put an animal under, their systems are thrown off, a little bit out of whack, and things that they normally could regulate become something that need to be done manually by the people watching them, the people caring for them during the procedure, in a lot of ways. And for a giraffe, the needs are very unique. And vets have to work really, really hard and do a lot of extra things and be very, very careful when that animal's under procedure. So a giraffe has unique challenges. A giraffe has unique challenges unto itself with caring for it and managing it in captivity. And now you're adding on this illness that it has, we don't really know much about, what causes it, how to really treat it. And those keepers at that zoo worked really, really hard. And the managers work really, really hard with everyone else to find a protocol, find a diet, find supplementation that really worked well for that animal. And it was very, very, very expensive. Legendarily expensive. It wasn't a running joke, but it was a running theme, how much money was spent on that animal. Something that zoo really had to deal with on a very true and big level. And you're never going to really sell guests on this animal being the only one to survive this illness. Maybe it would come up in conversation if a keeper's talking with a guest that, they might, that's interesting. But you're never going to make money off that. That giraffe was not worth any more from a marketing, from a guest appeal point of view than any other giraffe. And they put a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of time and a lot of work into that animal to figuring out how to care for it in the best way possible and give it the best life that they could. Despite the fact that there was no boon, the keepers did everything in their power. They did their best, and I respected them for that.
You might want to consider that the vast majority of animals in zoos aren't even endangered. There is a very, very long list of endangered species that zoos have absolutely no interest in keeping because they would not generate a lot of traffic and be profitable assets.
Listen, folks, I would love to see the day when every zoo was just a haven for the endangered species, was basically pure conservation. That's all it was. But life is not fair. Zoos need to support conservation, but they also need to support themselves. And, in a lot of ways, the list of the animals that people really, really, really want to see on an ongoing basis, on a yearly basis, is surprisingly short. Those animals are big, They cost a lot. They're sexy as hell. And not all those sexy animals are endangered, folks. Well, there was one year that we had the big exhibit designer, the big architect guy. He did a seminar for the zookeepers to talk about exactly what it went into designing an enclosure. And the big thing, I don't remember all the higher stuff that he talked about. It was never something I dealt with on a daily basis. But the one thing that I did come away with is how even a relatively unimpressive enclosure, how expensive it gets and how quickly it gets expensive. How quickly it gets to the multi-million dollar level. And when you know that, and you know how much you're making as a keeper, which really isn't that impressive, and you know that the fact that you're at a zoo that's working with a lot of the same old buildings that they had 30 years ago and doing the best they can, you know that money is definitely at a premium. And you have to make some really hard decisions. And one of those decisions is what to do with your space. Let's say that for whatever reason, you want to have an enclosure at your zoo for a species of hippopotamus. And you have to make a decision between the Pygmy hippopotamus, which is highly, highly endangered, or the common hippopotamus, which is very much not as endangered. In an ideal world, you give the Pygmy hippo some help. But you have to consider that the Pygmy hippo is a very, very shy animal. One of the reasons why it's endangered is because it's hard to find in the wild. They have a hard time figuring out exactly what the numbers are. That feeds into how you conserve an animal. A Pygmy hippo on exhibit is not super interesting. It's a lot smaller than the hippo I think we're more used to thinking of. It doesn't have that giant mouth. It looks like a baby hippo, basically. Where you think of the big African one. That's like you think of on the savannas and stuff like that. It's not representative at all. It's a much smaller animal. Sometimes it's hard to find on exhibit. If it's lying down in a pile of hay, it disappears very quickly. But a big common hippopotamus is a sight to behold. Those animals, they have the giant mouths. They're very gregarious. Even when they're in the water, they're in the water a lot. You look in the pool, you can see the big dark thing. That's the hippopotamus. You can see them when they surface, and the big spray from their nostrils comes out. It's a compelling thing. When they open their mouth, that's an absolute thing to see. It's a really cool animal. And the Pygmy hippo doesn't have a lot of those things going for it. And you have to make that decision. On some level, if you're thinking about your escapes, those go into, what animals you put on exhibit. As much as I am a big fan of the black-footed ferret, I went to the San Diego Zoo and I sat there for hours in front of the black-footed ferret exhibit. I'm sure people came up to me like, what the heck you doing, son? It's just a ferret. But I sat there and I waited for that thing to come out because I knew the story. But a zoo cannot have every exhibit with a black-footed ferret. No one will come to see that. On some level, that matters. You need to generate money in order to feed all your animals, in order to take care of them. And in order to do that, you have to have some animals that people are going to see, that people really want to see. And they're not always the most endangered animals. That's something that zoos deal with. Do you want a Pygmy hippopotamus, or do you want the common hippopotamus? It's not always such an easy decision. It's always not such a straightforward cut decision. There's real money, real necessity, real logistics to consider in that question that are outside of which animal is the most endangered.
And blame the zoo, oppose the conditions of white supremacist capitalism that have allowed these types of institutions to absolutely thrive.
I'm not going to sit here and pretend that zoos are perfect, that zoos are ideal. But I think they have a role to play. I think that they are necessary. I reject the idea that somehow zoos are not perfect, that they have issues, and therefore they need to be closed. I think they've played an important part in helping some species recover. That's not something a point that I'm willing to compromise on. I want to see zoos improve. I want to see them get better. I want to see them be a part of the equation because I believe they have something to offer. They're innovative places where people come up with new ways of doing things. So I choose to support the zoos. I choose to give them money. And that's all I have to say about that.